Okay, so get this. We're diving into some pretty heavy stuff today.
Oh,
You
yeah.
sent over a whole stack of sources, right?
Yeah.
About this attempted federal funding freeze back in 2023 by the Trump administration.
It's wild. It seems like it touches everything,
It really does.
from food stamps to student loans to even Meals on Wheels.
Wow.
Like, we've got a lot to unpack here. The
Yeah.
common thread seems to be federal aid programs, this funding freeze, and a whole bunch of legal challenges.
It's 2025 now, but this was big news back then.
Right, exactly.
It wasn't just a blip. This was huge.
And that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive, to help you understand what exactly went down, why it matters, and what the lasting impact might be.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. Let's start with some of these phrases that keep popping up. We've got OMB, Memo, M2513, Project 2025, and Impoundment Control Act.
Okay.
Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, let's tackle those one by one. So OMB memo M2513, that's where it all started.
That memo, straight from the Office of Management and Budget, basically told federal agencies to hit the brakes on new grants and contracts. It was a big deal,
So basically a government-wide spending freeze.
basically.
Wow. Why would they even attempt something like that?
Well, the Trump administration framed it as fiscal responsibility.
Okay.
But a lot of people saw it as a way to force through their agenda of shrinking the federal government.
Interesting.
And that's where Project 2025 comes in.
Okay.
It was a plan put forward by the Heritage Foundation, a conservative think tank,
Okay.
detailing these drastic cuts to the size and scope of the federal government.
So this freeze could have been a step towards those Project 2025 goals.
That's the idea.
Oh, wow.
But there's this law, the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. It throws a wrench in that plan.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was specifically designed to limit the president's power to just withhold funds that Congress already approved.
Okay.
You know, if you think back to Nixon,
Yeah.
this was a direct response to his attempts to impound funds for programs he didn't like.
So checks and balances.
Checks and
I
balances.
like it.
Yeah.
So Congress says spend this money, and the president can't just turn around and say, nope, change my mind.
You got it.
Okay.
And that's exactly why this memo caused such a firestorm. Critics saw it as a clear violation of the Impoundment Control Act,
Yeah.
a serious overreach of executive power.
Well, you mentioned legal challenges earlier, and we see a lot of mentions of Judge Block's freeze and a name, Judge Lauren Alicon. So this actually ended up in court.
Oh, yeah. Multiple lawsuits were filed.
Wow.
And Judge Alicon's ruling was the big one. They declared the freeze unlawful, blocked it. It was a huge victory for those who opposed it, and it put a hard stop to the Trump administration's plan.
So, okay, we've got this memo, this court battle, this big conservative agenda looming in the background. But let's get down to, like, brass tacks here. Who was actually impacted by this freeze?
We're talking about SNP benefits, Medicaid, student loans, Pell Grants, federal housing assistance. Everything was thrown into a state of uncertainty.
So wait, so this wasn't just some, like, political chess match.
Oh, no, no, no.
We're talking about people potentially losing access to food,
Absolutely.
healthcare, education, housing, the essentials.
Yeah, you're reading between the lines perfectly. And remember, these programs aren't just random government initiatives. They often serve the most vulnerable among us.
Right.
Families struggling to make ends meet, seniors who rely on Meals on Wheels,
Oh, wow.
people with disabilities who depend on Medicaid for health care. It was a scary time for a lot of people.
It's not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It's people's lives.
Exactly.
One snippet mentions Medicaid portals down, and we've got quotes from state officials like J.B. Pritzker in Illinois and Letitia James in New York sounding the alarm. What was it like on the ground during all of this?
Think utter chaos and confusion.
Yeah.
States depend heavily on federal funding to run these programs.
Yeah.
And the sudden freeze caused a logistical nightmare. There were reports of massive delays in processing benefits, jammed phone lines, and people being turned away from services that they desperately needed.
One source even mentions food banks being overwhelmed by people suddenly worried about where their next meal is coming from.
Yeah.
That's heavy.
It is.
It really hits you in the gut.
It does. And this wasn't just some, short-lived glitch. We have reports of people experiencing temporary lapses in benefits, missing rent payments, and delaying medical care because they just couldn't afford it.
The stress alone must have been unimaginable.
Oh, absolutely.
Not knowing if you'll be able to feed your family or keep a roof over your head, that takes a toll.
It does.
And it makes you question what would have happened if this freeze had gone unchallenged, if Project 2025 had come to fruition.
Yeah, exactly.
You see, the Trump administration have eventually rescinded the freeze.
Right.
But What happened in the meantime? Did people actually lose access to these essential programs?
Well, that's a good question and something that we'll need to look into. There are definitely reports of disruptions and delays,
Right.
but how widespread that was
Yeah.
and the lasting impacts, well, that's something we need to examine more closely.
It's scary to think about. I mean, even temporary disruptions to these programs
Right.
can have such a devastating effect on people's lives.
Absolutely. And we also have to consider the psychological impact. The fear and uncertainty that this freeze caused, that can have long-lasting consequences as well.
That's a really good point.
It's something we often overlook when talking about these big policy decisions.
Yeah.
But the human cost is real.
It is. So let's dig into that a little bit more after a quick break.
Sounds good to me.
We'll be right back. It's hard to fathom the level of disruption this caused, even if it was temporary. But we keep seeing this term, rescission, pop up.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
Rescission is like hitting the undo button on spending. Congress has already approved.
Okay.
The president can request it,
Okay.
but Congress has to give the thumbs up. It's not a common move.
So it's more permanent than a freeze.
Yeah.
Like they're not just delaying the spending, they're trying to completely cancel it.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And the Trump administration tried to use it to permanently axe funding for some of these programs.
Mm-hmm.
But remember that Impoundment Control Act we talked about?
Right.
It's all about limiting presidential power when it comes to spending.
So did Congress go along with this rescission plan?
Nope, not really. They mostly rejected it, which again points to that power struggle between the branches of government.
So you mentioned earlier that this wasn't just about budgets, it was a power play. And this Project 2025 seems to be at the heart of it. Can you paint a clearer picture of what they were actually proposing?
Project 2025 was basically a roadmap for a dramatically smaller federal government.
Okay.
We're talking deep cuts to social programs, environmental regulations, even the federal workforce. Pretty radical stuff.
Wow, so this attempted aid freeze was maybe just a taste of a much bigger plan.
Exactly. This episode needs to be understood within that larger context. It was a calculated move to advance a specific agenda.
It's a bit unsettling, isn't it?
Yeah.
To think that this freeze could have been just the tip of the iceberg?
It raises some important questions about the direction some people want to take this country.
Yeah, for sure. We've talked a lot about the politics, the legal battles, and the potential for, like, a completely different America. But I keep coming back to the human side of this, those snippets about, Medicaid portals down, families worried about food, seniors missing their Meals on Wheels deliveries. It's easy to get lost in the big picture and forget about the real impact on people's lives.
You're absolutely right. We can't lose sight of the fact that behind every policy decision, there are real people whose lives are affected. And these potential cuts weren't just abstract numbers. They represented potential hardship and suffering for millions of Americans.
We saw snippets about Meals on Wheels, Head Start, Section 8 housing. These are programs that provide a lifeline for so many.
Exactly. And Project 2025 went even further, targeting programs like SNP, Medicaid, and Pell Grants.
Wow.
Programs millions rely on for food, healthcare, and education.
It's hard to even imagine the ripple effect those kinds of cuts would have had.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that these programs aren't just handouts.
Well,
They're investments in people,
right.
in our communities, in our collective well-being.
You've hit the nail on the head. They're a safety net, preventing people from falling through the cracks. They represent the idea that we as a society have a responsibility to take care of each other.
This episode makes you appreciate the role of the judiciary.
Absolutely.
Judge Alicorn stepping in, blocking the freeze. It was a crucial check on executive power.
It absolutely was. This episode serves as a reminder that we can't take those checks and balances for granted.
We also saw how this story played out in the media.
Right.
Snippets from conservative outlets praising the freeze as fiscally responsible,
Right.
while liberal outlets condemned it as an attack on the vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how differently these events can be framed and how important it is to be aware of potential biases. We can't just passively consume information. We need to think critically about what we're reading and hearing.
So as consumers of news, how can we make sure we're getting the full picture?
Diversify your sources. Don't just stick to your usual outlets.
Oh, yeah.
Seek out different perspectives,
Okay.
both domestic and international. Don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions and biases.
It's about being an active participant in the information landscape,
Yes,
not just a passive recipient.
precisely. And remember, knowledge is power.
I like that.
The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to make our voices heard and advocate for the kind of society we want to live in.
Well, this deep dive has certainly taken us down a winding path.
It has.
From a seemingly simple funding freeze to this grand clash of ideologies, legal battles, and a potential alternate future.
It's been quite a journey, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Wow.
There's still so much more to explore. The long-term implications of this attempted freeze, the debate over the role of government, and how all of this impacts us as individuals and as a nation.
And that's exactly what we'll be digging into in part 3.
I'm ready when you are.
Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to try to, wrap our heads around everything we've learned about this attempted federal aid freeze back in 23. We've really gone deep here. From deciphering, obscure OMB memos to, dissecting court battles and even, imagining a potential alternate America shaped by Project 2025. So where do we land after all of this?
Well, I think it's safe to say this was about way more than just dollars and cents.
Oh, yeah.
It was really a battle over the very soul of America, a clash between two very different visions of, what the role of government should be in our lives.
We saw the Trump administration, right, driven by this conservative ideology, trying to, completely sidestep Congress and just freeze funding for these essential programs that millions of Americans depend on.
And they didn't just want a temporary freeze, you know?
Right. Yeah.
They were pushing for permanent cuts through that rescission process, which, as we've discussed, is not a common move at all.
It was pretty bold, wasn't it?
It was, and thankfully the courts stepped in. Judge Alicon's ruling was a powerful reminder that even the president, is not above the law.
It is a relief
It is.
that those checks and balances worked the way they were supposed to.
Absolutely. And it, reaffirms the importance of an independent judiciary. Think about it. A single memo, right, from a government office
Right.
triggered this whole chain of events that could have really drastically reshaped the lives of millions.
Wow.
It really underscores the fact that politics isn't just some abstract game played in Washington.
Yeah.
It has very real-world consequences.
It makes those snippets that we saw about people struggling to, access healthcare, food, and housing. Those weren't just anecdotes.
No.
Those were potential realities for a lot of people.
Absolutely. And when you think about the potential impact of Project 2025, the picture gets even more concerning. The depth of the proposed cuts, the scope of their vision for a smaller government. It's a reminder that this wasn't just, an isolated incident.
It was part of a much bigger strategy. And it's a reminder, I think, that we can't get complacent. We have to stay informed, stay engaged.
I couldn't agree more. This whole deep dive, it raises some really fundamental questions for all of us, right?
Yeah.
What kind of society do we want to live in? What's the government's responsibility to its citizens? And what role do we as individuals play in shaping the future?
We saw, how the story played out in the media, right? Each outlet with their own spin.
Oh, yeah.
It really highlights the need for, media literacy.
Absolutely.
We can't just accept blindly what we read or hear, right?
Yeah.
We have to evaluate the information critically, consider the source, seek out diverse perspectives.
You got it. Being a responsible citizen nowadays means being a discerning consumer of information.
Right.
Actively seeking out the truth.
That's a
Recognizing biases.
Yeah.
Forming your own informed opinions.
So where do we go from here? Even though, this freeze was blocked, what are, the lasting implications of this whole thing?
That is the million-dollar question. The freeze itself might be in the past,
Right.
but the ideological battle that fueled it, that's still very much alive.
Yeah.
This tension between different visions for the role of government, the debate over the size and scope of social safety nets, these are ongoing conversations that we all need to be a part of.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. The choices we make today, the actions we take, the conversations we have, they're going to shape the America of tomorrow.
And that's both a challenge and an opportunity.
Yeah.
We can't just be passive observers. We got to be active participants. Informed citizens engaged in the issues that matter most.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on. This deep dive has been, quite a journey. But hopefully it's equipped you with the knowledge and, the context to really grapple with these complex questions and to make your own informed decisions.
Remember, knowledge is power. The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to make our voices heard and advocate for the world we want to live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and, most importantly, we hope it inspires you to stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop questioning.